Hello. This week, you guys are going to be focusing on the first part of Chapter 2, which covers the history of our Constitution. It's basically what happened in our country to get us to the point where we have our Constitution today. Just to begin, it's important that you know what a constitution is. A constitution is a nation's basic law. It creates our political systems, it assigns or divides powers in a government, and it often provides certain guarantees to citizens. So it is the foundational principles of a government. And our constitution has a history that goes back to when before our country was even formed. Basically, we have to start by looking at why, what got us to our country before we can look at our constitution. The important things you need to know about our revolution are why we were having it. If you remember, maybe from U.S. history class, we learned about the fact that the French and Indian War happened in the late 1700s, and England afterwards had a lot of war debt, so they decided to cover that war debt by putting taxes onto the colonists. And the colonists didn't like this. Not only did they not like paying taxes, but they also didn't like that they did not have representation in the legislative body in England that was putting those taxes on them. This whole phrase that you all should know well from middle school history class maybe, or high school history class, taxation without representation. So in response to all those taxes, like the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts and all those things, the colonial leaders formed the Continental Congress, and it was a group of leaders who tried to address the abuses of the English crown. And, they tried to send a document to the King of England, King George III, to say, this is our concern, and we hope you will, address it, but the king didn't respond. So that moved the colonists to move to declare independence. So they wrote the Declaration of Independence, which listed all their grievances against the British, and it was adopted on July 4th, 1776 by that Continental Congress. It was the statement that declared our independence, and it's important to know that Thomas Jefferson wrote this document. But it's important to know what the founding principles were behind this document, because they are also the founding principles that led into our new government. The first principle, well, basically all these were based on English ideas, English philosophy ideas, and maybe some French as well. The first one was natural rights. Natural rights are this idea that human beings have basic inherent national rights. Inherent is a complicated term to understand, but it basically means that these rights are just a given. They don't have to come from the government. The government doesn't have to give these rights to people. They're just a given. All human beings should have these rights. They come from nature, and those are the rights of life, liberty, and property, or happiness, as John Locke put it. Also, a basic idea that our colonists were basing their decision to declare independence from is that government should be formed based on the consent of the governed. Government derives its authority by the sanction of the people. The people have to give consent to the government to do the governing. That is the definition of this term, popular sovereignty. Whenever we see the phrase popular, it's referring to the people or the population. Sovereignty means to rule or to have power over. So popular sovereignty means that the people have power, and that is one of the foundational philosophies behind the revolution that was taking place. They felt like they weren't having a say in their taxation, and that was a violation of, their natural rights. The last one is limited government. Limited government says that there should be certain restrictions placed on the government to protect the natural rights of citizens, that the government can't just go and make any law it wants or take any action it wants. The King of England was able to do that at that time, and they thought that that was a violation of what should be, a natural right of humans. So they believed in founding this new independent government on natural rights, consent of the governed, and limited government. And some of those English and I think French philosophers that gave us those ideas are John Locke, most importantly, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, we're not going to go into the events of the revolution because you learned that in history class and you won't be tested on it. But what we need to know is after the revolution, we had a new constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And we learned that a confederate form of government is really a loose union of states where the states have all the powers and there's no strong central government. And so innately, this was a very weak document because the colonists were afraid of giving too much power to the central government because that might be too much like having a king. So they created a confederate form of government. But unfortunately, that meant that their new nation was very weak. This was our first constitution at last from 1777 to 1787. And it was a confederation, which is a league of friendship and perpetual union among the 13 states. And the biggest weakness was that the national government, which was only Congress, there was only a legislative branch, no executive or judicial, had very few powers. They couldn't tax, they couldn't form an army, they couldn't regulate trade, and also there was no president or national court system. So it was very difficult for them to accomplish anything because they couldn't enforce any of the policies that they created. And really all the government power rested in the states. And a lot of problems started to develop because this. And ultimately this first government was our government that failed under the Articles of Confederation. There was a lot of turmoil, especially economic turmoil. That revolution cost the colonies a lot of money. And the farmers and the people who were fighting in it a lot of money. And there was a depression that followed the war, and a lot of the farmers were unable to pay their debts. So the states were passing these laws that were sympathetic to the farmers because, they wanted to keep their people happy, and the laws favored the debtors over the creditors, meaning the people that couldn't pay their bills didn't have to. But then there was no money and no taxes generated to fund this new government, and things were really a mess, and there was a lot of disputes going on. For example, Shays' Rebellion happened in Massachusetts, where a series of attacks on courthouses by a small band of farmers was led by Revolutionary War Captain Daniel Shays, because the courthouses were trying to allow the foreclosure proceedings on all their farms, but the farmers didn't want to let that to happen, and there was no powerful national government to stop these attacks. So the economic elite was concerned about the Articles of Confederation's inability to limit these violations of individual property rights. So really there was just no system that could step in and stop this economic turmoil. So ultimately all these elite people decided to have a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, because they were trying to fix the Articles of Confederation, but really not a lot of people attended, and it wasn't very successful. So the significance of this Annapolis meeting was that they decided to call for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787 with the goal of fixing the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, we'll see that instead of fixing the Articles, they instead created our new Constitution. So this is a quick history of our revolution, why the revolution happened, and then the first government we had that was created as a result of that revolution that was very weak and led to basically deciding to create our new Constitution.